Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we have a bit of a mission. We're going to try and dismantle a monument. We're going to look at the anxieties that built one of the greatest poets in the English language, Alfred Lord Tennyson.
It's funny, when most people think of Tennyson, they get this one image in their head. It's the grand Victorian icon.
The beard, right, the big imposing figure.
Exactly. The solemn statue you see at Trinity College, Cambridge. He just seems like this monolith, a figure so established that he feels, well, frankly, a little bit extinct, cemented in the 19th century.
That is the standard image. The poet laureate, velvet coat, maybe that big Spanish hat. But our deep dive today is all about the sources from his early years, that really crucial period between the 1820s and the 1840s. We're looking for the young, anxious, awkward, and I think vitally the beardless student. This young man was not a monument, not yet. He was an intellectual radical whose mind was being completely reshaped by these huge scientific ideas that were redefining what it meant to be human.
It's a really remarkable period of synthesis. We're looking at a poet who was grappling with so much at once. You've got this catastrophic domestic chaos on one hand, and then this profound personal grief. I mean, the kind of loss that just fundamentally changes your entire worldview.
Right.
And then on top of all that, you have the revolutionary scientific concepts of his age, the new astronomy, the discovery of what they call deep time geology, and these terrifying early theories of biological evolution.
And these weren't just abstract ideas for him, were they? Not just topics for a clever poem.
No, not at all. They truly shook the foundations of his faith, of his inherited beliefs, and they really gave him a whole new language for his imagination.
Absolutely. So this isn't just a literary history exercise for us today. It's really a look at how an entire generation tried to find its footing when the ground beneath them, and I mean that literally, geologically, was shifting so violently. We'll see how Tennyson's life, his intense friendships, his deepest sorrows, they all became completely intertwined with the newest and, frankly, the most unsettling scientific knowledge out there.
And our sources, they clearly show him emerging not just as a great lyricist, carrying on the Romantic tradition. He's arguably the first truly modern scientific poet. He's this essential, sensitive bridge.
Bridge between what, exactly?
Well, he takes that intuitive sensibility of the Romantic movement forward, but he applies it unflinchingly to the cold, evidence-based, and often terrifying realities that Victorian science was presenting. And that tension, that's where his greatest power really lies.
Okay, so let's unpack that journey. Let's start at the beginning. The chaotic, contradictory foundations of his youth at Somersby Rectory in rural Lincolnshire. What do the sources tell us about that environment?
Well, the setting itself was almost painfully picturesque, but at the same time deeply disturbed. Somersby was this remote country village, very quiet, very isolated.
But close to the sea.
Only about 15 miles from the wild, roaring North Sea coast. And the rectory itself was sprawling, a mix of architectural styles. They had, Gothic vaulting in the dining room, these rambling, yellowing curtains upstairs. It was a home of visual splendor, but, well, a lot of psychological gloom.
And behind that rustic beauty, there was this profound dysfunction, this pain. Dr. Tennyson, his father, he was an alcoholic scholar.
Right. He felt he'd been cheated out of his inheritance, and he just grew more and more isolated. He was prone to these violent, abusive outbursts. The sources confirm the situation got so bad he actually had to be sent abroad for a cure.
So it was a house of fear.
A house of mounting fear, absolutely. An immense psychological pressure cooker. Several of the children later struggled with their own mental health issues. And you have that terrifying detail the sources mention.
The cook.
The cook. The inexplicable incident where the cook somehow caught fire in the kitchen and burned to death. That kind of tragedy, unexplained and so violent, it just hangs over the whole childhood environment. It created this atmosphere of terror and profound insecurity for all the children.
It's the ultimate contradiction, though, isn't it? Because despite this domestic nightmare, Dr. Tennyson somehow managed to surround his family with this intellectual treasure trove. We're talking about a library with, an estimated 2,500 books?
An immense collection for a country rectory at that time, and that library was Alfred's salvation. Even when his father was ill-tempered or just absent, that intellectual resource was always there. This is where Alfred got his self-education, especially in science.
And his father encouraged that?
When he was sober, yes. He encouraged his son's intellectual pursuits, and you have to remember, Tennyson didn't go through the conventional public school system, so the sheer volume and a variety of those books shaped his mind in a really unconventional way.
And one of the foundational texts that sounds a bit dry to us now, but it was a publishing sensation at the time, Jane Marseille's Scientific Conversations books, specifically Conversations in Chemistry from 1805.
Oh, these were seminal texts of the Romantic Age. They were explicitly designed to open up the then very closed world of experimental science to a much wider, non-academic audience.
For young people.
Specifically for young minds, meaning teenagers, and quite radically for the time, that included young women. Marseille was a true pioneer. She reinvented the educational dialogue. You had a knowledgeable tutor, Mrs. B, and her two pupils, the dutiful Emily and the mischievous, slightly romantic Caroline.
And Marseille's genius was making the abstract feel relatable, even fun, turning chemistry from just dry theory into a story. And what was that famous aha moment example they used?
It's the analogy she used to explain the composition of water, H2O. Mrs. B explains that oxygen has a greater affinity for other elements than hydrogen does. And the mischievous student, Caroline, she immediately seizes on this idea of affinity and invents what she calls sexual chemistry.
Right, I remember this. She basically framed the water molecule as two hydrogen atoms in unrequited love with one oxygen atom.
Exactly. Leading to this stable but dramatically charged compound. And that imaginative narrative approach framing chemical bonding in terms of human emotion and unrequited love, it ensured that readers remembered these complex principles forever.
It's a revolutionary way to democratize science, isn't it? Making it accessible not through math, but through empathy and story.
And the proof is in the history. Michael Faraday, one of the finest experimental chemists of that generation, a working-class man who also had a non-traditional education, he later credited Marseille's conversations with giving him an anchor in chemical knowledge that guided his whole career.
Wow.
So these books didn't just teach facts, they changed the public's whole attitude toward the process of scientific discovery. They taught the young Tennyson that science was an imaginative, creative endeavor, not just a set of dry rules. Hashtag 1.2, the Boundless Deep, and the extinct monster.
And that intellectual curiosity, stoked in the library, it meets the physical reality of the Lincolnshire landscape, specifically the boundless sea.
Yes. Tennyson had an absolute lifelong passion for the sea, especially the wild, unpredictable North Sea coast at Mablethorpe. The family had a cottage there.
It was his place of solitude.
Profound solitude, haunted by what he called the ceaseless, thunderous roar of the breakers. And you see it in his writing immediately. There's an early childhood prayer where he reflects this immersion, asking God, "Thou hast created the immeasurable sea. Thou givest and thou takest life. Thou destroyest and thou renewest."
Even there, you can already hear the tension that defines his later work. The creative power versus the destructive, indifferent force of nature.
And that boundary between the known shore and the unknown deep, it led directly to one of his earliest, most memorable, and most unsettling poems, The Kraken.
The Kraken, the monster that sleeps for ages of uncounted time. It's fascinating that this creature, which seems so mythological to us, was actually a subject of serious, well, speculative, but serious discussion in the 1820s.
It was a kind of proto-cryptozoology, like this Loch Ness monster today.
Exactly.
And this is where the lines between myth and science really blur for Tennyson. The Kraken actually had a scientific pedigree. It was formally cataloged by Carl Linnaeus, the great taxonomist, in his Systema Naturae in 1735.
He actually listed it.
He did, categorized it as a cephalopod of immense size. Now, he later withdrew the entry, admitting he'd never actually seen one himself, but the idea had already entered the scientific register. It was sort of provisionally real.
So it exists in this weird liminal space, scientifically recognized but mythologically monstrous. What did that creature symbolize for his generation?
It symbolized the deep, dark mysteries that science was trying, but often failing, to fully rationalize. We have an account from Mary Somerville, the mathematician we'll talk about later. She recalled hearing the Kraken legend from Scottish fishermen as a girl.
And for her, what was it?
For her, it represented all the superstitions and untamable forces of nature. The rumors claim the Kraken was so colossal that when it surfaced, covered in seaweed and sand, sailors would mistake it for a new island.
A sleeping, monstrous threat lurking just below the surface of the rational world. And the poem, it ends with the Kraken being awoken by the last fire and then dying in the final line.
And that ending is what makes it feel so modern. It's why some people call it the first modern science fiction poem. It's an extinct creature, a product of deep time, surfacing one last time before it vanishes forever.
So it's anticipating the theme of extinction.
Right. Whether mythological or scientific, it connects directly to the existential fears of deep geology that were about to burst onto the scene. It definitely anticipates the grand oceanic horrors of, Melville's Moby Dick or Jules Verne. He was already thinking about deep time and the vast indifference of the abyss. Hashtag 1.3. Early cosmic doubts in technology.
And this intellectual training wasn't just confined to books and the sea. It was hands-on. He had an early technical engagement with the instruments that extend human perception.
Yes, his father encouraged practical investigation. Young Alfred used a solar microscope to study insects and plants from the garden, dissecting that miniature world. And perhaps more importantly for his cosmic imagination, he used a telescope to study the moon and the stars from the rectory lawn at night.
And that interaction with the telescope, it revealed a very personal scientific fact, didn't it?
It did. The act of using the magnification of the telescope revealed his own physical limitation. He was profoundly short-sighted, and this physical impediment immediately led him to question the nature of reality itself. If his own eyes couldn't perceive the stars accurately without a mechanical aid, then how far were the stars physically real? Or were they just, as he put it, delusive shows created by the limits of human optics?
So this is where the philosophical anxiety of science first enters his own writing. Right in the middle of a piece of teenage drama, no less. In his adolescent Gothic play, The Devil and the Lady, he just breaks off the narrative to give the devil this sudden existential monologue full of radical skepticism.
It's an absolutely astonishing passage for a teenager. He expresses total doubt about the entire Newtonian universe. He asks if suns and spheres are realities or semblances of that which men call real, are ye true substance?
And he's using highly technical scientific language. He talks about objects being bound by an unseen repulsive potency.
Repulsive potency, that phrase points directly to the latest Newtonian gravitational theory, specifically the forces that keep things apart in space, not just bring them together.
Right.
So this wasn't just vague adolescent angst. It was sophisticated science-informed doubt about the fundamental mechanics of the universe. The idea that the stars might not exist at all, except as these delusive shows projected onto our faulty perception. It suggests he was already engaging with philosophical concepts of idealism, like those from Bishop Berkeley.
The idea that matter might not exist independently of the mind observing it.
Exactly. Using physics as his starting point, the boy who wrote that was already set up to question everything. He leaves Summersby profoundly equipped to handle scientific facts, but inherently skeptical of his own ability to perceive any kind of ultimate truth. So in 1828, the intense, solitary intellectual world of Summersby is suddenly exchanged for the vibrant, competitive society of Trinity College, Cambridge.
A huge shift. He was still awkward. He had that thick Lincolnshire accent.
Yeah.
He felt very provincial. But at Trinity, he finds his anchor in one extraordinary person, Arthur Henry Hallam, the Golden Boy.
Hallam was the absolute antithesis of Tennyson. He was well-heeled, socially dazzling, incredibly articulate, and just immensely ambitious for intellectual and political change. They became inseparable.
And that friendship immediately propelled Tennyson into the center of radical intellectual thought. The Apostles. Tell us more about the Apostles. This wasn't just some casual debating club, was it?
No. This was an elite, semi-secret discussion society. It was strictly limited to 12 undergraduate members. It was basically a closed, radical intellectual pressure cooker where you could test ideas without any censorship from the older establishment. They'd meet on Saturday evenings, drink tea and coffee, and debate these motions that were, well, they were designed to tear down traditional orthodoxies.
And the topics they tackled in 1829 alone showed just how revolutionary this little group was. They were not debating Latin grammar.
Far from it. Let's look at 3 specific motions. First, whether Shelley's poetry had an immoral tendency. Both Tennyson and Hallam voted no. That's a huge signal of approval for Shelley's political and social radicalism, his critique of organized religion.
Yeah.
Second, whether the existence of an intelligent first cause is deducible from phenomena. Again, Tennyson and Hallam vote no. They are questioning the core premise of natural theology, the idea that you can prove God's existence by observing nature.
That is a direct challenge to the entire prevailing religious culture of the day.
It's huge. And third, whether there is any rule of moral action except general expediency. Tennyson and Hallam voted aye, rejecting utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number.
Well, they weren't just questioning religion, but the prevailing ethical systems of the age.
Exactly. They were trying to carve out a space for a personal, intuitive, ethical action that was beyond just simple calculation. This whole environment just confirmed all of Tennyson's existing doubts and pushed him toward real intellectual independence.
And we should also mention the formal intellectual influence of his tutor, William Whewell, who was teaching at Trinity at the time.
Whewell was a polymath. The man defied easy categorization. He was an amateur poet, a respected physicist, a translator of Goethe, a highly influential philosopher of science. He had a gift for coining new terms. He's famously responsible for introducing the word scientist itself in 1833.
Wow.
And he also introduced Tennyson to foundational geological concepts, particularly catastrophism.
So just to put that in context for everyone, catastrophism was the theory that the Earth's history was dominated by these massive, sudden, violent events, often linked back to things like biblical floods.
Right. Before that, the prevailing view was often a short chronology linked to the Bible, a world that was only a few thousand years old. Catastrophism, while violent, was at least a step toward grappling with a much longer history, and Tennyson's imagination instantly absorbed these ideas of violent, sudden upheaval, hashtag 2.2, cosmological discovery versus geographical reality, Timbuktu.
Tennyson's 1829 prize poem, Timbuktu. It stands as this perfect literary marker of that moment, the moment when myth and modern discovery just collide, filtered through everything he was learning at Cambridge.
The poem uses a masterful contrast to define the anxiety of the period. It starts by summoning this traditional, glittering, fabled Miltonic image of Timbuktu. It's presented as this mysterious center of Islamic splendor, with its pagods hung with music of sweet bells. It's a pure, imaginative projection of exotic wonder.
But then reality crashes in.
A spirit intervenes, warning that this mythic mirage will yield to the bleak realism of keen discovery. And this is a direct reference to the recent, really disenchanting reports from the explorer René Callier.
He had actually reached the city.
He had, and he reported back that it was just low-built, mud-walled, barbarian settlements, a profound disappointment for the European imagination. Geographical reality was literally shrinking the world's mystery.
That loss of geographical mystery must have been profound for a generation raised on romantic adventure stories.
It was a deep disillusionment. But Tennyson makes a crucial scientific pivot. He counters this geographical disenchantment with the imaginative gains of the new astronomy. He shifts the scene from the lost city on Earth to the boundless, expanding expanse of the heavens, newly revealed by technology.
Specifically, by William Herschel's improved telescopes.
Yes, Herschel and his son were mapping the universe in ways no one had ever conceived of before. Tennyson describes the astronomical views of nebulae and galaxies as blaze within blaze, an unimagined depth and harmony of planet-girded suns.
That's an extraordinary passage.
It is, because it captures the idea that even if the physical world was becoming mundane, the cosmos was expanding boundlessly in the human mind.
It was a prophetic vision, wasn't it? He's describing nebulae that look like galaxies long before that was common knowledge.
Absolutely. It anticipates the phenomenal deep space images revealed by Lord Rosse's Great Leviathan Telescope in 1845. And you could even argue it anticipates the Hubble and James Webb images of our own time. This idea of endless visible creation far beyond our solar system. So while man was shrinking geographically and culturally, the universe was expanding boundlessly. The myth of human centrality was already under attack from two very different scientific directions. Hashtag 2.3, the terror of extinction and deep time.
So if the telescope expanded the space of the universe, the final massive intellectual pressure of this period came from the geologists, who expanded the time of the universe. We have to turn now to Charles Lyell's monumental Principles of Geology, published starting in 1830.
Lyell's work didn't just challenge the Bible, it shattered the entire cultural framework of the age. He presented a uniformitarian worldview, the idea that the Earth was shaped by slow, constant processes over an immense period of time. Deep time.
And this timeline wasn't just measured in millennia.
Not at all. It stretched into millions, maybe billions of years, and it just relentlessly undermined mankind's status as the sole, primary, recent creation.
Let's dwell on the philosophical implication here. Why was this timescale so terrifying to young Victorians?
Because it completely demolished the traditional narrative of the great chain of being. The idea that every creature was fixed in its place, created specifically for humanity, and that humanity was the pinnacle of a recent creation. Lyell showed that the Earth was unimaginably old and that vast epochs had passed before humans ever arrived.
It made humanity an afterthought, a random blip.
Exactly. And Lyell's work confirmed the dramatic and highly controversial theory of extinction, which had been pioneered by figures like Georges Cuvier.
And this is the emotional core of the terror.
It is. The fossil evidence, these massive creatures like the ichthyosaurus, the fish lizard, and the iguana, they proved that thousands of species had simply vanished from the face of the Earth.
Which raises a visceral, terrifying question for a generation raised on the idea of a benevolent creator.
The question is, if God allowed the wholesale extinction of thousands upon thousands of species across these vast periods of time, was humanity likewise destined for inevitable ultimate extinction?
It's the theological crisis of a pitiless, indifferent natural world. The sources note how difficult it is for us today to really recapture that deep existential terror.
The only comparison we can make is to modern fears of a catastrophic nuclear winter or climate collapse, a scenario where the entire species is threatened, where our permanence is suddenly thrown into doubt. This wasn't abstract science, it was a deeply personal anxiety about mortality, about divine benevolence, and about the ultimate meaning of human history.
And Tennyson struggled with this acutely. He was really struck by Lyell's prediction that the perpetual changes of the Earth meant that future geographical mutations might allow creatures like huge iguanas and ichthyosaurs to reappear and displace man.
He internalized that vision so profoundly that he recalled it decades later. He confessed that he sometimes imagined, quote, standing by a railway at night, the engine must be like some great ichthyosaurus.
Let's just pause on that image for a moment. The steam engine is the ultimate symbol of modern industrial progress, of man's mastery over nature, the future charging ahead. And yet, Tennyson's mind immediately transforms it into an extinct carnivorous monster from deep time.
That analogy is just brilliant because it fuses scientific terror with industrial anxiety. It suggests that all our progress, our speed, our smoke, our iron infrastructure is just a temporary dangerous phase. The engine of progress is fundamentally a prehistoric lizard, suggesting that deep, random, indifferent history will ultimately reassert itself and devour the present. It perfectly sums up the intellectual and emotional shockwave of Lyell's geology on the poetic mind.
So the profound scientific and cosmological doubts that Tennyson was already carrying, the skepticism from the telescope, the terror of the ichthyosaurus, they collided violently with intense personal tragedy in the autumn of 1833.
September 1833. That's the moment the intellectual crisis becomes a personal devastation. Arthur Henry Hallam, the golden boy of the apostles, Tennyson's closest intellectual and emotional confidant, he died abruptly. A stroke in Vienna. He was only 22.
The loss was just absolute, not just for Tennyson, but for his whole family, since Hallam was engaged to Tennyson's sister Emily. It shattered the entire intellectual and emotional equilibrium of the household.
Hallam's father, Henry Hallam, he hoped Tennyson might write some kind of formal obituary or memoir to honor his son. But Tennyson was just. He was incapable of producing a structured piece of prose. The grief was too raw, too disorienting.
So what did he do?
Instead, he started filling a secret, long, Butcher Ledger-like book with these short, mournful elegiac poems. This fragmented, fiercely private collection was the scattered beginning of what would become In Memoriam AHH.
And the sources emphasize the raw, modern quality of this grief. It's described as startlingly immediate and intimate. We compare it today to works like C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, or Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, where the suffering is just laid bare on the page like an agonized stream of consciousness diary.
And you see that rawness in the stanzas where he's struggling to grasp the physical reality of the absence. He expresses what he called widower's feelings. There's a specific stanza describing waking up and instinctively reaching for the loved one in an empty bed. He describes the physical spasm of loss. Tears of the widower when he sees a late lost form that sleep reveals and moves his doubtful arms and feels her place is empty fall like these.
That imagery is incredibly powerful because it's so physical, so domestic, so immediate. It's a loss as a tangible, empty space right there beside you.
It is intensely intimate, and critics have long speculated on its precise biographical source. Was he recalling sharing a traveler's bed with Hallam during their trips, which was common for male friends? Or was it his attempt to capture his sister Emily's mourning for her lost fiancé?
But either way,
it captures the intense physical and emotional loss, and it's bursting forth in a form of poetry that was previously considered too private, too agonizing to be publicly expressed. #3.2. Arguing with suicide. the two voices.
So this emotional devastation, combined with the lingering trauma of his father's violence, it plunged Tennyson into a state the sources describe as utterly miserable. And this led directly to the decade-long composition of one of his most deeply philosophical works, The Two Voices, Thoughts of a Suicide, which he began in the summer of 1833.
The poem is a literal internal debate. It's a struggle for self-belief, for sheer survival. It captures the psychological condition of profound depression as a dialogue between an inner voice arguing relentlessly that thou art so full of misery, were it not better not to be.
And on the other side,
Against the poet's conviction that human life, something that is so wonderfully made, should not be cast in endless shade by self-destruction.
and this is where the scientific knowledge he absorbed as a child comes back to save him, in a way. He uses this powerful scientific metaphor to illustrate the optimistic side of the argument, the potential for transformation in nature.
That transformation is captured in the imagery of the dragonfly. The voice of life argues for this necessary, even violent transformation in nature. An inner impulse rent the veil of his old husk. From head to tail came out clear plates of sapphire mail.
The process is necessary and painful. Shedding the old husk is a violent rupture, but it results in a higher form. The creature is reborn with clear plates of sapphire mail.
It's a clear pre-evolutionary image of necessary progress through violent rupture. Even in the middle of this deep crisis of self-destruction and doubt, Tennyson finds a potential argument for endurance and progress that's rooted in the natural world's capacity for renewal.
So the progress of the self mirrors the potential progress of nature, even if that process is messy and agonizing.
It provided a vital intellectual anchor for him. John Kemble, another apostle, he immediately recognized the intellectual weight of the piece, calling them superb meditations on self-destruction that showed a mighty stride in intellect. It was a critical poem for his development, forcing him to grapple with whether life held intrinsic value, non-religious value, simply because of its complexity and potential for change. Hashtag 3.3, madness and the modern monologue.
The psychological instability that defined his father, and which pushed Tennyson to the brink, it continued to manifest in his siblings. By 1837, the family had to relocate to High Beach near Epping Forest because his brother Septimus was suffering from these severe fits of gloomy weeping and required specialized care.
And High Beach was a significant place. It was a place of seclusion for exhausted minds, run by a Dr. Matthew Allen. And critically, Allen followed the enlightened, humane treatment principles that had been pioneered by the Quakers at the retreat in York. He rejected the old punitive system of chains and isolation that characterized the madhouse era.
And Tennyson spent a lot of time there.
He did, and his reaction to the patients was telling. He was deeply fascinated by the mad people, whom he famously reported to his friend Spedding as the most agreeable and the most reasonable persons he had met with. He was perhaps recognizing a shared sensitivity, the thin veil between sanity and the chaos he himself had lived through.
And he likely encountered another great English poet there, John Clare, the peasant poet. He was also a patient at High Beach for 4 years, sometimes wandering the grounds, believing he was Lord Byron.
So this direct contact with clinical and poetic insanity, with minds that seemed less disturbed than the chaotic world outside the asylum walls, it deeply informed his later work. This experience directly fed into his great dramatic monologue, Maud, written years later, which delves into obsession, paranoia, and psychological collapse.
Right. Maud is told by a single, increasingly unstable narrator who descends into madness after losing his love. The sources quote that terrifying passage that explores insanity not as a frenzy, but as a kind of psychological burial.
It's that feeling of helplessness, of being overwhelmed, and my heart is a handful of dust and the wheels go over my head. He explores the idea of being buried alive by one's own mind. This theme of psychological burial, deeper, ever so little deeper, was later confirmed for Tennyson when he read Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Premature Burial.
Which also explored that Gothic terror of lying alive and helpless under the earth.
Exactly. It's clear that this decade, the loss of Hallam, the argument with suicide, and the immersion in the world of the asylum, it forced Tennyson to find new voices and new forms to process trauma. He moved beyond the conventional lyricism he mastered as a student and into the realm of the modern dramatic monologue, which allowed him to articulate the dark, fractured psychological state of the individual in the modern world.
So by the 1840s, Tennyson, still grieving but stabilizing professionally, he starts to publish again. And his poems become grander, reflecting the political and social ferment of the era, all viewed through the scientific lens.
And this leads us to Locksley Hall from 1842. It's presented as the monologue of a disillusioned soldier, embittered by lost love, but who offers this extraordinary, sweeping vision of the future.
It's astonishing foresight, isn't it? It functions almost like a short science fiction novel embedded inside a narrative poem. Despite the speaker's personal bitterness, which might reflect Tennyson's own frustrations over Rosa Bering, he offers this 20-line panoramic vision of technological progress and its consequences.
The vision starts, hopefully, promising globalization and trade. He sees the heavens fill with commerce, argosies of magic sails, which suggests, aerial trade and swift international connections powered by some mysterious future technology.
But the utopian vision darkens almost instantly.
It does. Tennyson anticipates future horrors. Heard the heavens fill with shouting, and there rained a ghastly dew from the nation's airy navies grappling in the central blue.
A ghastly dew raining from airy navies. I mean, that is a stunning, terrifying premonition of airborne warfare, of mass casualties dropped from above. It foreshadows the dogfights and bombing campaigns of the 20th century.
It shows that he didn't see scientific progress as inherently good. He saw it as a tool that amplified human capacity for both good and for utter destruction.
But the ultimate political conclusion offers a hope that transcends the military chaos.
Yes. The vision ends with the realization that this global industrial and military unification will lead, eventually, to the Parliament of Men, the Federation of the World. This is a clear, early vision of global governance and peace, achieved only after the horrific lessons taught by technological warfare. It stretches forward 100 years to H.G. Wells and the concept of international bodies designed to prevent global catastrophe.
There's a wonderful little technical detail here that the reviewers love to point out. The soldier mentioned civilization spinning forever down the ringing grooves of change.
Okay.
Reviewers noted that this magnificent dynamic image was technically inaccurate. The wheels of steam engines didn't run in grooves, they were flanged and ran on top of metal rails.
But the image stuck, didn't it? It captured the feeling of unstoppable, resonant, industrial change, even if the physics was a little off. It just became shorthand for the onward march of modern history. #tab 4.2, undulatory motions and female intellect.
As his career advanced, Tennyson continued his relentless self-education in science, often relying on popularizing texts, and significantly, those written by women. In 1838, he read Mary Somerville's On the Connection of the Physical Sciences.
Somerville was a massive figure. Her intellectual standing was so high that she was famously referred to as one of the only 6 people in England who truly understood Laplace's extremely complex celestial mechanics.
Wow.
And her book was a masterpiece of synthesis. It united these apparently disparate scientific phenomena, light, sound, heat, gravity, under the single concept of undulatory motions.
Wave-like forces. The idea that everything from a beam of light to the sound of a bell to a ripple in a pond was carried by these invisible vibrations or waves that connected the whole natural world.
Yes. And Somerville, like Marcet, she had a special gift for analogy, for making abstract physical concepts relatable. She compared the propagation of sound through the air to a field of corn when it is agitated by the wind, instantly creating this kinetic sensory image. She also used the ripple analogy. Observing wave reflection after a steamboat passes gives a perfect idea of the reflection of sound and of light.
And this wave theory fundamentally informed his poetry's sound and structure. It inspired some of his most musical and physically evocative lyrics.
You see it everywhere, particularly in his later lyrics describing the physical energy of the landscape. The long light shakes across the lakes, and the wild cataract leaps in glory. The light shakes, the water leaps. It's all carried by these invisible vibrations and wave mechanics. Science gave him a new precision for describing the aesthetics of the world.
And Somerville's exceptional intellectual standing as a female scientist also directly inspired Tennyson's engagement with a thoroughly controversial subject of the day: the establishment of a woman's university.
Indeed. His long poem, The Princess, from 1847, is centered around this radical idea, and the curriculum he outlines for this all-female institution includes the latest findings in astronomy, chemistry, and pre-Darwinian evolution. Somerville's career demonstrated incontrovertibly that women were capable of the highest intellectual pursuits, even if broader society was resistant to institutionalizing that idea. #, 4.3, nature, red in tooth and claw.
Now we arrive at the true intellectual climax of this entire deep dive, the moment the scientific and psychological threads violently intertwine, catalyzed by a sensational, anonymous publication. Robert Chambers' Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation from 1844.
Vestiges was not an academic treatise. It was a popular blockbuster. It outsold Darwin's Origin of Species for an entire generation. For a generation. It promoted a sweeping, if scientifically patchy, theory of universal evolution. It proposed that species changed and developed over vast periods, and it deeply unsettled the public by suggesting that humanity was not divinely fixed, but was merely part of a continuous, evolving natural system.
And the reaction from the establishment was not good.
It was immediate, furious, and often hysterical. Traditionalists feared it promoted rank materialism, the idea that matter, not spirit, was the basis of all life. Professor Adam Sedgwick, Tennyson's old geology professor at Trinity, offered a notoriously scathing critique of the anonymous author.
And Sedgwick's critique was steeped in the prejudices of the time.
Absolutely. He famously deduced, based purely on the book's perceived flaws, that the anonymous author must be a woman due to what he called the hasty jumping to conclusions. It was a classic misogynistic dismissal used to discredit radical new ideas. Sedgwick was genuinely terrified of the implications of Vestiges.
He even wrote furious marginal notes in his own copy.
He did. He covered his edition with angry, exasperated notes, demanding, for instance, in the margin, "But why do not monkeys talk?" It just shows you how deeply the religious and scientific establishment felt attacked by the very idea of humanity being connected to or evolving from animals.
So Tennyson distilled the most terrifying implication of this reading, combined with the evidence of Lyell's deep time and extinction, into the central evolution sequence of In Memoriam, Canto 56. This is where he fully articulates the horrifying indifference of nature.
This is the iconic moment. He challenges the traditional consolation of faith. He uses the tangible evidence of geology, the scarped cliff and quarried stone, to ask a question of God. So careful of the type, but no. From scarped cliff and quarried stone, she cries, "1,000 types are gone. I care for nothing, all shall go."
The implication is clear. Nature is speaking, and she is utterly indifferent to man's existence or survival. And then comes the line that defined the century's spiritual crisis.
Though nature, red in tooth and claw with ravine, shrieked against his creed.
Nature, red in tooth and claw. That phrase became shorthand for the cruelty and chaos of the evolutionary process. It was a bitter, unprecedented vision of a universe utterly devoid of human concern. It anticipates Darwin's concept of natural selection by years and surpasses anything explicitly stated in Chambers' original book.
It utterly destroyed the romantic notion of nature as a kind, maternal figure that offered gentle comfort.
It was a profound philosophical statement about the human condition, trapped between spiritual yearning and pitiless scientific data.
If God allows species with splendid purpose to just vanish like the ichthyosaurus, what hope is there for man? The individual life meant nothing to the vast amoral evolutionary or geological process. Hashtag 4.4, the compromise of the prologue.
And the sources indicate that Tennyson was acutely aware of how challenging, how profoundly skeptical and violent this section within Memoriam would be for the Victorian public. He was trying to secure professional independence to marry Emily Selwood. He couldn't afford to be branded an atheist.
He had to manage the reception very carefully. That section with red in tooth and claw was actually omitted from the first private printing of the verses because he recognized it was simply too explosive. He was caught between his poetic necessity to tell the painful truth and his professional necessity to conform.
So, to mitigate the profound doubt and violence in the body of the elegies, Tennyson added a traditional, deliberately reassuring prologue just before the poem's official publication in 1850.
This prologue was a masterful act of strategic PR. It was an essential disclaimer, a carefully worded statement of traditional faith designed to satisfy the public's need for spiritual comfort. It includes the famous lines that many Victorians preferred to quote.
Right. Our little systems have their day. They have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they. So by referring to these massive scientific frameworks from Lyell and Chambers as mere little systems that are just broken lights compared to God's ultimate truth, he's essentially dismissing decades of intellectual revolution in one sweeping poetic statement.
But it was essential for the book to become a massive cultural success. It gave the public permission to read the grief without being tainted by the doubt.
A necessary pragmatic compromise.
It was. This statement allowed the public, who were desperate for spiritual comfort after the scientific shocks of the past decades, to embrace the poem as a religious text, as a testimony to enduring faith. Leading figures like Charles Kingsley hailed Tennyson as a champion of vital Christianity, despite the profound, unanswered doubts contained in the internal debate of the work itself.
So the prologue allowed the doubt to be smuggled into the drawing rooms of Britain under the guise of piety. Hashtag outro. So we've charted the transformation of Alfred Lord Tennyson, not as the monolithic bearded laureate, but as the young man forged in the crucible of family chaos, profound friendship, and the deepest scientific revelations of his time. He moved from grappling with the mythological kraken of the unexplored deep to wrestling with Lyell's deep time and Chambers' shocking pre-Darwinian evolution.
His poetry became the most sensitive testing ground for the biggest existential questions of the era. Is there a God? Does humanity matter in the vast scale of time? Are we ultimately destined for extinction? And the astonishing thing is that this period of scientific ferment, combined with his deepest personal misery, the family chaos, Hallam's death, these bouts of profound depression, it didn't silence him. It propelled him to his greatest, most enduring work.
His grief, married to the cold, unflinching data of the natural world, gave him a voice that resonated with the anxiety of the entire century. He took the terror of deep time and the violence of extinction, and he synthesized it into a distinctly modern, agonizing yet ultimately enduring articulation of doubt and hope.
The crisis of belief didn't destroy him. It made him the defining poet of the age.
So we leave you with this final, provocative thought, one that echoes the tension we've discussed between the private terror and the public compromise. Tennyson, once terrified of extinction and family chaos, later became the monumental poet laureate, celebrating national pride with poems like The Charge of the Light Brigade and upholding the Victorian establishment. Given how much the cold and different new science informed his private despair and doubt, does the enduring tension between his personal philosophy and his public role as the poet of the British Empire remain the great, painful contradiction at the very heart of his entire body of work?
A question that perhaps only a true deep dive into his life, far beyond the statue, can truly begin to answer.
Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.